My name is Ronnie Mize. Stuart introduced me. I'm the Chief Security Officer for ETech Global Services. I have been accused of being a little long-winded, so Stuart called me up and said I had 45 minutes, and so you'll know my surprise when I thought that was the introduction. So I've had to change how I'm going to do this a little bit, but bear with me. So we're going to make this as informative and dynamic as possible. Our approach today is going to be to ask questions of each one of the panelists regarding data privacy, the GDPR, and other related subjects, and let them respond accordingly. Now, if anyone in the audience feels strongly about a panelist's response, we encourage you to raise your hands and ask questions. We want to make this as conversational as we possibly can, okay? And make it informative. We have about 45 minutes to actually cover a lot of ground, so we're going to attempt to save some time at the end for general QA if we need to, and closing remarks, but if not, we'll try to get through this. Okay, before we get started, I've got a few questions for the audience. How many of you are actually responsible for data privacy in your organization? A few hands? Okay, you guys know it's a trick question, right? Everybody in here is responsible for data privacy in their organization, okay? How many of you work in security or compliance? A lot of you. Okay, you work in security and compliance, you didn't raise your hand before? Okay, how many of you actually work in technology? Okay, a few more, okay. How many of you know about the GDPR? A lot of you. How many of you know what we have to do to comply with the GDPR? Okay, session's over. Okay, how many of you already seen impact in your organizations because of what the European Union did with the GDPR? How many of you feel that more stringent privacy legislation is coming in the United States as a result? That's correct. California has already enacted their law, their privacy law, 2018. Goes into effect in 2020. Okay. How many of you actually know the difference between data security and data privacy? How many of you think they're synonymous? Okay. Yeah, that relates to my daughter. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a huge Dallas Cowboys fan. Yeah, thank you. Anybody that doesn't know me and has seen them play over the last couple of years is probably asking why. But I'm a huge Dallas Cowboys fan, so I have a Dallas Cowboys man cave in my house. And my daughter, she has turned it into her playroom. So now there's Shopkins and Barbie dolls and dollhouses and everything in there. And so I only go in there and watch the game and I exit post-haste. So I'm kind of asking myself right now, why do I know what a Shopkins is? But anyway, my daughter goes in there all the time, and my wife I heard her get onto her one time about spilling Gatorade. She takes Gatorade in there. She spilled Gatorade all over the wood floor in the room. And she got in trouble for it. We had to go in there and clean it up. And she said, Rain, if you do this again, you're not going to be able to play in there or take drinks in there. So I'm in the bedroom one evening, and I hear my wife talking to my daughter, my little 6-year-old daughter, and says, Rain, you spilled Gatorade all over the floor again. Your daddy's going to be furious. So she said, I don't have to tell him. So she comes and she tells me. She said, Rainey spilled Gatorade all over the floor in there, you need to go in there and clean it up. So eventually I went down to the Dallas room and looked in there, and there was no evidence of Gatorade anywhere. And I said, Rain, your mom said you spilled Gatorade. And she said, Daddy, do you see any Gatorade? No. She said, do you see a Gatorade container anywhere? And I'm like, no. And she said, there you go. Of course, when I walked in there the next day, my feet were sticking to the floor. That's kind of like data privacy, is what can you get to and what can you see? Okay. So with that, we've got some very talented individuals for the panel today, and I'm actually going to let them introduce themselves.
Let me start here?
Start.
Okay. All right, I'll start here. So I'm Steve Augustino, a partner with Kelley, Drye, and Warren. We do a lot of work on communications, privacy, consumer protection, both at the FCC and the FTC. And Ronnie, I'm just going to say, it seems to be pretty clear you have a young lawyer on your hands.
I'm Ed Bartholme. I'm with an organization called Call for Action. I also currently am chair of the FCC's Consumer Advisory Committee. Call for Action is the largest national organization and the only one that talks to consumers every day. So we're partnered with media outlets in 22 markets across the country. Each of those markets has a volunteer staffed consumer help hotline. The media partners promote that hotline, and then we take calls to help people mediate consumer issues. Last year we recovered about $8 million for consumers, and we deal with a lot of sort of day-to-day pocketbook issues. So it's the dishwasher that they've been out to fix 4 times and it still isn't working correctly. We help you get over the hump and get that resolution. But then in DC, we also enter into a lot more of the policy-driven discussions. We're not an advocacy group, we don't lobby, we don't file comments on things. But we do sit at the table, and we're often invited into the room because of the fact that we're one of the few groups that talks to consumers on a daily basis.
My name is Matt Dumiak. I'm the Director of Privacy Services at Compliance Point. I recognize a few faces in the room. Compliance Point is a consulting firm. We assist organizations with complying with direct marketing, privacy, information security, regulations, and frameworks. So I'll keep it short and sweet, knowing that we only have 45 minutes today.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Well, we all see how important data privacy is becoming, and it's becoming more so, especially if you are seeing the contracts that are coming in from some of our partners and companies that we're doing business with. Contractual language has been maybe a clause or a sentence in a contract before around data privacy and security. Basically, it's almost a third of the contract now. So companies know how important it is that we start protecting our data as well as our clients' data. So with that, I'm going to ask the first question. It's something that we talked about just a little bit while ago. What is the difference between data privacy and data security?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give the first shot and you guys add in, absolutely. So I think data security, when we think of data security, it's the technical and security controls around the personal data. So encryption, website security, things like that. Data privacy is a different way of thinking about it, and I like to think that it sits behind data security, although they do play together and layer on top of each other. Data privacy, if we look at the principles under the GDPR or some of the key tenets of CCPA in California, it's about choice, it's about transparency, the principles, so if you're limiting how long you hold on to data, things like that. Again, they do play well together, but with security, everyone's always trying to break in, right? You see breaches every day in the news. Privacy is what sits behind that, because if you don't have anything to lose in the first place, that means you're operating from those key tenets, right? You have the security and the main controls up front, and then in the background, that's how your organization really, how you handle the data and how you manage it.
The one thing I'll add to that is that privacy tends to focus on certain types of information that is considered to be unique or special. Data security, though, covers all of your information, really. It's the protection you have against all of the information that you have there. So it's a little bit broader in concept as well.
And I think I'd add, from a consumer perspective, there isn't a difference. Pew Research has shown that consumers conflate these two. There's growing concern about security and privacy, and they're synonymous with each other for consumers. We hosted International Data Privacy Days January 28th. We did a phone bank at our DC partner. So I got all these great privacy experts that I had available to me to come and answer consumer calls about privacy. So we go in the air and we're saying, call us with your privacy questions. What do you want to know? Every single phone call was password hygiene. How do I set a strong password? I'm concerned about the Equifax breach and my data. What should I be doing? Hardly any of them had to do with what privacy advocates and what privacy lawyers would consider to be privacy. It was all really focused on breach and security. There were over 1,500 data breaches in 2017, and that's what consumers are constantly hearing about, and that's why they're conflating the two.
What are the competitive advantages of making privacy and security a priority as a company, and how would we justify those exercises to the C-suite?
I'll start this one. I think you just heard the answer from Ed, right? The consumers want this. I mean, they are concerned about this. We thought that this was kind of, with millennials in particular, like they're really comfortable turning over information, nobody cares. That has not been the case. When you have a breach or, any kind of public controversy, it impacts your brand, it impacts the things that you're trying to sell, and that is, I think, the main reason why you need to pay attention to this. Plus, there are, of course, obviously, there are big penalties coming around for a variety of things, but I think the consumer part of this is the main reason to focus on.
And I think I'd say that security isn't really an argument that should be being had anymore. Security is a must at this point. When we think about the California context specifically, there's no private right of action in the CCPA when it comes to privacy. California does have a breach law that has a private right of action. Given it's a really high bar to meet, it's sort of like one blatant disregard, and I'm sure that's hard to prove. But I think that you're more likely to see, potential losses around security issues than you are privacy right now. Now that might change as we have more and more privacy laws, but the way the landscape is now, security is a must.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, both of you. And speaking specifically to the service providers in the room or the call centers, it's a competitive advantage because we all know that your clients are coming to you with specific demands, or if they're shopping around to find a service provider, they're going to ask you about your security posture, your privacy posture, if you have model processes to comply with these rights, these notice requirements under these regulations that are coming through. If you can be proactive in that approach and say, yes, we already have these processes, we already have these procedures, we operate from an accepted information security framework, that's a competitive advantage over your competitors who may not have heard of these regulations or are still thinking about how to comply. Also, these regulations, it's a roadmap, it's a journey. They do take a long time to comply. So I know that occasionally you might get a request from a client, you go, hey, that's very easy to implement, we'll go ahead and turn around and do that. That's not the case with these regulations. It's a different way of thinking about personal data. It's a different way of thinking about security. And so be proactive about that. Have a framework so that when one of those large clients, one of those large opportunities comes to you, you can be proactive in providing that to them and not scrambling to put something together that, again, would give you an advantage or disadvantage over your competitors.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question. We all know how important data security has been to all of us over the years, and I work in security now, but before that I worked in technology. So it was all about the firewalls and the antivirus and the anti-malware and how people could come through the front door and protecting that entrance, or protecting that accessibility. But now it seems like everybody has those controls in place. I mean, if you don't, then you're way behind. So now would you say that data privacy is actually taking a front seat to that? Because now what we're seeing is instead of all of those controls, we're starting to see terms like pseudonymization from the GDPR. We're seeing data minimization. Then you have the encryption standards that we want. So would you say that data privacy now is kind of taking the lead? Or no?
Well, I think that's a fair statement. I mean, we've all mentioned you see breaches in the news every day. I think it's obvious that behind security is privacy, and that's where you can really ensure that you don't lose sensitive or data that's regulated under these regulations. As well, someone's always trying to break in, and I think the fact that you see these breaches every day show that frankly it's not working, right? So what do you have behind that? You have privacy.
Right. But still, I would say, we haven't solved data security either, right? I mean, yes, we have all those things, right? But this is the the weak links in the change, right? Yeah, fine, you got great firewalls and front protection, right? But when you can bypass that by collecting information from insiders, password information, then you're in, right? And there's many different ways in which that can be defeated. And people are loose with their information. There's laptops and things like that. And third parties, one of the relevant things here, I think, is that there are more and more of these controls on third parties, because a lot of the major breaches that you see were third parties that mishandled data that was trusted to them. So those who have the data are much more concerned with how their third parties are handling it these days.
Okay, so let's hit on that just a little bit. So basically, you're talking about the human factor then. Yeah, and I've heard the statement that malicious actors They no longer smell silicone, they smell blood. Because basically the human factor is the weakest link in any organization. Okay? So awareness then would be key as well to anyone's data privacy.
Yeah, absolutely, getting that out there. And sometimes, I think organizations make this harder because when you're told to change your password regularly, people revert often back to something that's simple and easy, and then they just go, it's password 1 and then password 2, and it's like, so it's self-defeating sometimes to add all these extra things in. It has to be something that works, that's intuitive for your people, and they have to know about it certainly, but you want them to be able to implement whatever procedures you do decide to put in place.
And that goes to the sort of concept of it being part of the culture throughout the entire organization.
Well, I know with the GDPR, release of the GDPR now, California's kind of jumped on as well. And there seems to be some renewed angst around data privacy with everything that's happening. So, and most of us have heard about the GDPR. So what is the potential impact today of GDPR regulation on the contact center industry?
Well, there's a lot of them, and I was impressed with all the hands that said they knew how to comply with GDPR, because I did not raise my hand in that. I mean, there's a lot that we still need to learn about it. Just like one thing I want to highlight for people here is that one of the new things that GDPR does is that it puts explicit restrictions not only on those who are collecting the data, which is the controller's idea within the GDPR. Those are people who determine the purpose and the means for which the data is collected. But processors also have obligations under the GDPR. And call centers are much more likely to be processors than they are to be controllers here. But this is the first time that we see explicit requirements on those entities as well.
And I would add to that Europe's in the business of exporting right now. They're sort of going around to other countries around the world and saying, hey, this is a good roadmap that you should be thinking about following. Japan's adopted privacy legislation recently. Brazil is modeling theirs off of what Europe's doing. I would imagine Canada is a place to pay attention to, because it won't be long before they're considering similar bars and similar hurdles in their regime. And then some of that will eventually trickle into whatever we land on here.
Yeah, and I think as a processor, in terms of GDPR, as Stephen had to talk to, in the call center, you're the front line of defense for a lot of organizations, and so consumers will call you and be asking about their data, be making specific rights requests, things like that. So that's something that I would think that would also impact the call center industry. It's just making sure that you can be proactive, and even with your clients that you feel like you're within scope of GDPR, you get an idea that, yeah, we're a processor. Be proactive in developing that. Also, it's not just about rights or principles. With processor obligations, you're going to have to demonstrate to your controller clients that you can meet Article 32 security of processing, for example, and operate from records of processing and some other things that might take some time. But I think really you're the front line of defense and you interact the most with consumers. So they're going to be asking, what data do you have on me? How do you process it? I want to make a right to access request, like things like that. To be proactive and know how to handle those would be the right call.
Okay. Here's a question I get asked a lot. I'm not doing any business in the European Union, nor am I working with anyone doing business in the European Union. Why should I comply?
Well, I mean, keep in mind Ed's point, first of all, right? That this is probably the first step in a trend, right? That our privacy laws have had these, steps as we've gone through, kind of disclosure and then consent, and I see GDPR really as the next step, focusing on control with new rights that consumers have to request the deletion of data, for example. Those are new things, and I think that we will see versions of that in other places. But then separately, the law is written very broadly. If you're collecting data or processing data on residents in the EU, even if you're outside of the EU, you can be impacted by that. It can cover you. So you need to think about that, first of all. And then secondly, just when we deal with clients, talking through the idea of having multiple systems for protecting your data, well, I'm collecting EU data, so now I have this system, but if I'm only collecting US data, I'm going to have this system. That's a really complex thing to try to implement, and not something that we think, that we generally recommend you try to do. If you can find a common ground, that's a lot easier to implement within your organization.
And I think too that it's transparency and choice are some of the paramount principles of the GDPR, and that's where a lot of privacy advocates would tell you that's a best practice, right? That's where consumers want to be. The National Cybersecurity Alliance has done some research that shows that 66% of consumers want companies to earn their trust by being open and transparent about how they're using their information. So I think it's a consumer-driven business practice that GDPR is put into sort of a codified form.
Yeah, great point, Ed. And so, and as you you see the privacy wave is coming, so it's a copycat world. I think legislators are likely to look at GDPR as kind of the gold standard. Also, maybe you're not within scope today, but unless you're ready to just flat out be out of scope in the future if a business opportunity comes to you, it would be a good idea to start looking at this regulation as well as others and starting to comply.
So basically, in essence, it's really a good idea to prepare at the very least. I will have to say this, we're looking at, the contracts that we're getting in weekly at our organization, and we deal with a lot of clients that do business in the European Union, but we're not a processor for them in the EU. But they are putting addendums in the contracts that state we will comply with GDPR in the event any of those records ever find their way into our systems. So they're calling out, compliance with GDPR for that. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well.
That's sort of the two systems, right? I mean, those clients of yours, they don't want to have two different systems either, right? It's very, very hard to track the data, and particularly tracking the source of the data, which is really the way these laws apply now. The California law applies to information about California consumers, regardless of where they are, right? And the EU one does the same thing. And once you have the data in your system, it's really hard to keep that piece to it. So I think a lot of the controllers under the GDPR terms are going to want to have a single system that covers all of their data.
So I know the GDPR actually gives the individual more power to opt in, more consent, more control of their data. So from the sense of a contact center perspective, I mean, what could we do to actually begin to comply? I mean, what are some of the things that can be done at the contact center level?
Yeah, sure. So I think at the contact center level, we talked about it a little bit, but being prepared to talk to consumers about how your clients are processing their data, what data they have. So the subject access requests, escalating breaches to your clients, things like that, if that were to occur, but really looking at those processor obligations and saying, okay, we need to be prepared to meet these for our controller clients, and then realize that, again, you're the front door to the business. We all know, consumers often think that they are speaking to the company, not a third-party call center or a service provider. And so when they're talking on the phone, they expect that you'll know that type of information.
No, I think you got it really, because we have advice we're giving for controllers about how to collect your consent and the changes that are coming on that. I don't think that is going to be the primary impact for this audience. I think it's really the opt-out parts of it, the deletion request, and how you recognize those, process those, and pass those along, I think are the main things you're going to need to focus on.
And I think too, just in the context of more products that are being sold, more services that are being sold are data intensive. Having that as part of the scripts, right? So when consumers have questions about how is this IoT device that you're, the call center for, using my data, knowing where to send them, knowing how they can find that information, even though it's not necessarily your responsibility as the contact center to have that under some of the laws that are coming about. I think that's just good business practice and a good consumer customer service choice.
Okay. Yes, sir.
All this is going to be adding administrative costs and overheads to what we do. So I just wanted to look at that for a second. And, doing things efficiently is important as we do things in compliance. Because all of this is really not adding value. It is supporting risk, which has value, but it's not really adding value to the business. But I just wonder, in addition to working for a single system, which Steve was talking about, whether you have any tips about how to approach all this. Have you seen people who've done this in a way that's particularly efficient and that we can learn from?
Well, I'll add one thing, and then we'll see what others. When we start with a privacy engagement, we do a questionnaire, basically just asking about the information that you have. And one thing I will say that we see is that because of how cheap data storage is, a lot of entities save data for much longer than they actually need it. And that, as these new obligations come on, just adds to your burdens. If you're keeping this really old data, and now I think GDPR, one of the negative consequences of that is you're sort of have to link data together now in ways that you may not have otherwise. So if you look up front and make sure that you're efficient with your data and only keep it as long as you really need it. And a lot of people don't ask that question of, do I really need this? Or do I still need this data? And I think asking that is important.
Yes, so the person I had heard of GDPR was at the April convention pace, and that it was going to be effective May 25th, which was a pretty narrow timeline. And when I remember that, they said that the European Union had set up general guidelines that were taking effect, but it was going to be up to each of the individual member nations to enforce the guidelines as they chose, to whatever degree. And the other notable thing was that the size of the fines was very large compared to the fine structure that we see in TCPA and TCR. So what my question is, in these months that have transpired, what are you seeing with regard to unequal application across the European Union? And have there been any notable cases that have already come up where huge liabilities have been incurred?
His thoughts on this as the lawyer in the room, but there is the European Data Protection Board that's going to ensure that that is applied consistently across the member states. I don't think we were going to see as much inconsistent application as we did under the directive previously. And so I think there will be more consistency across how it's enforced. I think what you'll see differs at the member state level is the level of enforcement and how many resources the member state might have and the culture there, right? So you can imagine that in countries like Germany or France or the UK, they have more resources. They've always had kind of very stringent privacy laws, whereas countries like Portugal or Spain might have had a little bit of a slightly different culture around it. They're required to implement legislation under this regulation and enforce it. But again, that's where I think you'll see a difference is, depending on resources, how likely is it that a country that might be on the smaller side scale of that go after, talk to companies about their privacy processing activities, right? So, Steve, anything or Ed?
The only thing I'd add is that we're expecting to have more guidance come through, and until we start to see that, it'll be hard to answer those questions about how consistent it really is going to be. If the guidance is more detailed, it gives us all a direction to go to. Right now, we're operating on what we think is going to be sufficient, and so there's a lot of judgment from the people giving you advice at this point.
Have there been any headline enforcement actions?
Not yet.
We wind up like what we've got with our own government, where consumers call in hundreds of millions of complaints, and you wind up with six enforcement actions over 10 years or something, just to, raise the flag and say government's doing something?
I don't think so. There has not been an enforcement yet, but I mean, it went into effect in May. It takes a long time to investigate these types of things. Also, even though there's not a class action lawsuit or availability to consumers, they do have a private right of action, if you will. They can seek damages, but again, they can't form a class.
And there have been a couple things filed against some large companies, and a lot of discussion has been, who are they going to go after first, right? Like, everybody thinks that this is a FANG, so to speak, targeted effort where they're going after the big American companies like your Googles and your Facebooks. So we're all curious, is that really where they're going to strike first, or are they going to go after a data broker that nobody's ever heard of?
And I have seen some circumstances where they just simply, the member states have stopped processing the data. We don't think you're processing it correctly under this regulation, so cease processing activities. If we see that it continues, then we're going to look into this. So there's that action as well.
Couple questions surrounding, most of our members are in the contact center business. And when DNC went into effect, the biggest problem we had was, besides the inability to call people, was having to deal with 50 states, 50 state rules, do not call lists. And that's obviously a concern now, because if you can imagine, the cost of complying with 50 different states coming with their rules is really a challenge. And in fact, it'll probably hurt the consumer because it'll never happen quickly. I'm really, and I know you and I had a conversation about this before, but I'd really like to see from the consumer standpoint, what's the benefit of having one federal law that takes care of this privacy versus this 50 state actions, that could follow it.
Yeah, and organizationally and personally, I'm sort of a firm believer that having a single federal standard is to the benefit of everyone. I think right now there are 54 data breach laws in the US. I'm guessing that counts territories that might have slightly different laws than some of the states. That's not good for anybody. And when you get to something like data and data privacy, it's really hard to draw lines, right? So I'm a consumer in Maryland this morning, I'm in DC now, I could easily be in Virginia. The company who's processing that data might be California-based, they might be Illinois-based. So whose laws apply? Who do I go to complain? This was also a big issue. It's not just having a federal law and a federal standard, but who's the agency that is in control of that? There was a big debate about a year ago around, or a year and a half, 2 years ago now, around FCC versus FTC, who was better positioned to do anything on privacy. And what you don't want to end up with is a scenario where consumers aren't really sure who to voice their concerns to. I think that we're all in agreement that when there are bad actors who are doing things incorrectly, there should be repercussions and there should be an avenue for those repercussions to be put into place. Not having a clear single point to go to makes that really difficult. So I don't know, I'm not advocating for a specific agency to be given this power, but I do think having a single place where consumers can go for a single federal privacy law would best serve consumers and companies.
Here, but we're not going to get to that. I mean, first of all, even at the federal level, right, we have lots of different laws for different types of data. So just harmonizing, if we were just harmonizing the federal laws, that would be a task in and of itself. But the trend seems to be having a federal law that is a floor with states that can then go above that, and then you have the same problem again, because now they're going to add on, California's law, which we may or may not get time to talk about here, covers biometric data. That's the first one that I've seen that covers that. And, so to add something new into this is still going to have that complexity problem with the way things are going, even if we do get federal legislation.
And I think the ballot initiative actually allowed for federal preemption.
Yes, I believe so.
The ballot initiative that led to the law that now doesn't allow for preemption did allow for preemption should there have been federal law.
My question is right now, not in the future, 6 months or a year from now, right this moment in time. In your opinion, does GDPR apply to US-based call centers making calls exclusively within the United States? What is your opinion?
Well,
Go ahead.
I was going to ask if you were processing any EU personal data.
The way the GDPR is written, Article 2, 3, and 4, right now, a US-based call center making calls exclusively within the borders of the United States for US corporations. In your opinion, does GDPR apply?
It depends.
Yeah, that's exactly. I can't give you any absolutes on that because if you are processing data about EU persons, then it covers that, even if your calls are within the US. I would say, you know, with the very narrow confines that you've given, it's unlikely. But, you know, we talked before about how those confines that you listed there can change very, very rapidly, right? One new customer has some new stuff, and so, you know, I think it's unlikely you're covered, but I do think you need to pay attention to this.
So if you have somebody who's a national of an EU state, for example, living in New York City, and you call them in New York City, they are in the United States, living in the United States, but they're carrying a German passport, for example. They are living physically in the US, and you are calling them in the US from a US-based call center. So I'm making it even more specific. In my opinion, GDPR doesn't apply, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, let me ask you this, doesn't GDPR stipulate if they're an EU citizen, they fall under the GDPR regulation?
EU natural person, so no citizenship or residency. Privacy is a fundamental human right in Europe, and so that's why they feel like we don't have adequate data protection laws, is because it's not a fundamental human right here. And so, Steve, do you have some opinion? I tend to defer to attorneys in terms of questions around scope and the regulation.
I just, with all respect, I think that ends up going beyond what we can do in a panel, okay?
Right.
I think that you're really asking for a judgment call that you should hire somebody to spend the time to really dig into that and give you an analysis of the risks involved with your options there.
Yeah, it's an in-depth analysis, really. It's great.
So not surprisingly, I had a similar question, but I'll take it at the more general level because I've seen a lot of debate about whether this is actually about EU citizens or EU residents or simply location. So and that's really the clarity that I'm looking for, which may not exist. Does this matter if you happen to be processing data on someone that you've got a US number, but they happen to be in Brussels at that time? Is that a scenario in which GDPR comes into play, or could, I guess? I'm not asking for legal advice. Just is that a possibility, or is it just citizenship and residence, and that's all you need to worry about?
It's not citizenship or residency. I think that, again, going back to that fundamental human right, if they are in Europe, they are within scope. Doesn't matter if they are a citizen or not.
Subjects in the EU who are offering goods and services to EU data subjects is kind of where this is. So there is a lot of judgment on that. There hopefully will be some clarity that we get in guidance in time. We just don't have enough to give any real confident answers on that right now.
Okay. Sorry.
I just had a fast question. For data processors that do store European EU citizen data on their servers based in America, such as a company that rents server space, if you will, that person running the server space, the company's customer, has their own customers that are within the EU. Now, I know under the GDPR that whole chain still is covered under the GDPR, but that customer with their own EU customers, do they have the ability to force the company with which they're renting the service space from into a DPA that they have drafted, as opposed to a DPA that the company itself has kind of like a form letter, like a form DPA. Does that make sense?
I'm going to punt on that. I think that's a little too specific for us, unfortunately.
Sure.
We have time for one more question if anybody has one.
No one wants to talk privacy?
Well, I do have a question I want to ask because I think it's important because we're all talking about the GDPR, but we also have to think about what is the legislation going to look like in the U.S. We already know that it's going to be coming from the individual states because of what we're seeing with California. So, and we talked about, a standard, legislation coming out of the federal government, who would be more likely to be able to control that. But what do we feel like the landscape is going to look like in the U.S. over the next 5 years?
One word, confusing. So, yeah, I think that we've talked about it a lot, the wave is here. There are very large organizations, Salesforce, Charter, their CEOs are calling for federal legislation because they want to have a say in how it's developed, what's involved in it, how it applies really. And so, I think we'll see really, but I think it'll be confusing. I think it's going to happen at the state level first. We've talked a lot about California. That was a ballot initiative. It got passed within a week, I believe. Things just happen quicker at the state level, as we all know. And so I think there's likely going to be a few state regulations that pop up before we start thinking about this broader federal legislation.
Yeah, it's hard to get anything from the U.S. Congress right now. So, I don't have a lot of hope for that to happen quickly. The other thing I want to point out is as we move to this control, the costs of compliance are going to go up, I think. I just got a real quick story about this. The FAA has a database for people to register noise complaints and for planes flying overhead. And one of the things you have to do is you have to give them like 20 different data points on there, including what time of day, where you are, and the flight that was overhead and things like that, right? Well, enterprising people who care a great deal about this will create apps to enforce those rights. And there was a story, you may have seen it. The guy created a little clicker. So instead of having to log on and put all the stuff in there, people could sit there and press a button on their clicker and it would gather that data and immediately submit that complaint to the FAA. And the FAA was overloaded with complaints and didn't know how to process them. And opt-out requests, deletion requests, I see that as a real warning here, a real potential problem, is that these people that are, really out there about privacy are going to create these apps, and people are going to be able to push a button on their phone and ask you to delete all the data you have on them. It's going to be hard.
And I think that security will probably take a little bit more of a front seat because as more and more connected devices come online, that's something that we can't continue to ignore as a society because the potential consequences are just so great there. I don't think we've hit the privacy breaking point, interestingly. I think everybody thought it was going to be the Facebook Cambridge Analytica, but that didn't seem to move the needle enough. What I do think we're starting to see, though, is there are more and more uses of data to exclude and to negatively impact consumers. And as those disparate impacts continue to increase, I think you're going to see a lot more civil liberties groups, a lot more civil rights groups engaged in these conversations, and then there might be more potential to move the needle in terms of a bigger, across the landscape, federal privacy initiative. I would just throw out one other thing. We talked a little bit about GDPR and some about California, but Vermont actually passed a really interesting law earlier this year that deals with data brokers and the need to register as a data broker with the Vermont State Attorney General's office. I don't know that any of you would qualify as a data broker, but that might be something to start to pay attention to as well, because I think not only are states worried about their privacy protections for their consumers, they're also going to be more interested in knowing who has that data and how that data is moving so that they can then better enforce laws that come on the books.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have today. I want to thank each one of the panelists for their expertise. If any of you guys would like to, meet up with them individually afterwards, I can make that happen for a nominal fee. But thank you all for coming here today. Certainly had some great questions. This session, quite frankly, could probably went the entire day. There is a lot of information to cover, but we really appreciate you coming. Thank you.